My wedding went viral, but not for the reasons I dreamed of. 200 guests watched my fiancé laugh as his mother called my dad trash. I walked out humiliated. Minutes later, my father walked back in, revealed he owned their billion-dollar company and left them in ruins. I'm Clara Hayes, and this is the day I turned heartbreak into justice. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The air on Beacon Hill always felt thinner, like it only belonged to people who were born breathing it. I wasn't one of them. Late November 2023. The trees along the narrow streets were all shades of gold, the sidewalks swept clean as if someone had been polishing the season. I parked my beat-up Toyota Corolla in front of the Whitford residence and stared at the iron gates as they opened automatically. For a moment, I wanted to turn back, but Jonathan's voice echoed in my head. Relax, they're traditional, not snobs. Right, traditional. The house looked like a postcard from old Boston. 3 stories of gray stone and glass with hedges trimmed so sharply they looked like green knives. I stepped out, clutching the small bouquet I'd brought, instantly regretting the grocery store wrapping. The front door opened before I even reached the porch. "You must be Clara," said a woman in her late 50s, dressed head to toe in beige Chanel. Her smile was perfect, practiced but cold around the edges. "From South Boston, yes." I forced a polite nod. "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you for having me." Her eyes flicked over my navy dress, my cheap heels, the coat that had lost its belt 2 winters ago. "Of course. Jonathan told me you'd be joining us." Jonathan appeared behind her, tall and polished in a blazer. "Mom, this is Clara Hayes. Clara, my mother Eleanor." Eleanor's handshake was soft but distant, lovely. "Dinner's just about ready." She turned before I could answer. Inside, everything gleamed. A crystal chandelier threw light across marble floors. The walls were lined with oil paintings, portraits of men who looked like they'd never worried about rent or rust. I caught my reflection in a gold-framed mirror and wished I'd picked a darker lipstick. Jonathan led me into the dining room where the table stretched forever. White linen, 10 chairs each set with a name card. I tried to smile when Eleanor poured wine, so she began. "Jonathan tells me you work in design." "Yes, landscape architecture. I work with the city's urban renewal department." "How nice." Her tone was the kind that made nice sound small. "So you plant trees?" I smiled, trying to keep my voice even. "We redesign public spaces, parks, plazas, riverwalks. My last project was the Franklin Square renovation." Eleanor tilted her head, swirling her wine. "Oh, how charming. Harold, remember the community garden near the train station? They probably hired someone like that." Her husband, a quiet man with gray hair and expensive glasses, gave a non-committal grunt. Jonathan glanced at me with an apologetic half-smile under the table and squeezed my hand as if that made it better. The meal went on in long silences and clinking silverware. They talked about real estate art auctions, charity galas, worlds that felt galaxies away. Every now and then, Eleanor's gaze returned to me, polite but dissecting, like I was a specimen that didn't quite belong in the exhibit. Halfway through the second course, I excused myself to the bathroom, staring at my reflection under the soft lighting. My lipstick had faded. My smile looked forced. I whispered to myself, "You're fine, Clara. Just breathe." When I returned, Eleanor was talking about family. "Jonathan's always been ambitious," she said, her voice sweet with pride. "He understands the importance of marrying someone who shares the same values." Jonathan shifted in his seat. "Mom, what I'm simply saying, compatibility is important." She turned her smile toward me, razor sharp. "Don't you agree, dear? I do," I said, "though I think values are less about where we come from and more about how we treat people." For a brief second, Harold's fork paused midair. Eleanor's smile didn't falter, but something flickered behind her eyes. Dessert felt longer than the entire meal. When the plates were cleared, Eleanor stood and placed a manicured hand on her husband's arm. Her voice was soft but deliberate. "I do hope our son knows how to choose the right person to walk beside him." The words were meant for him but aimed straight at me. Jonathan looked mortified. "Mom." She ignored him. "Coffee, anyone?" I declined. My stomach was tight, my throat dry. I thanked them for dinner, told Eleanor it had been lovely, and walked out into the freezing night. Jonathan followed me to the car, fumbling for words. "She didn't mean it like that." He said, "Yes, she did. She's just cautious." You know how families like mine are. I do now, I said quietly, opening the car door. He sighed, leaned down. Give her time, please. I nodded because arguing felt pointless. He kissed my forehead and I pretended it made me feel better. Driving down Beacon Street, the city lights blurred through my windshield. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Eyes bright with humiliation, I refused to cry out loud. I parked outside our small apartment in South Boston. The warmth of home hit me instantly. The faint smell of soup, the hum of my father's old radio. I sat in the car a moment longer, breathing, voiceover. I thought I could live with differences. I thought love could bridge the gap between their world and mine. But when she said the right person, I realized she wasn't talking about hearts. She was talking about bloodlines. I turned off the engine, the lights of Beacon Hill fading in my rearview mirror like a dream I was finally waking up from. The drive back to South End was painfully quiet. Streetlights flickered past the windshield like silent accusations. Jonathan's hands stayed fixed on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale in the glow from the dashboard. Neither of us said a word until he pulled up outside my building. She's just protective, he said finally. Eyes on the road. She doesn't mean anything by it. Protective, I repeated. Jonathan. She practically called me a project. He sighed. She's old-fashioned. It's just how she is. She believes in tradition. And you think that's okay? He hesitated. I think some battles aren't worth fighting. That stung more than anything Eleanor had said. Right, I whispered. Peace over dignity. Got it. Clara. Good night, Jonathan. I opened the door and stepped out. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and sobering. The sound of the car door closing behind me was final, like the thud of a gavel. He didn't call after me. The engine hummed for a few seconds before fading into the distance. When I reached the apartment, the lights were still on. My father, Richard Hayes, stood at the stove stirring soup. The smell of chicken and thyme filled the air. He looked up as I hung my coat. You're late. How'd it go? I tried for a smile. It was fine. His mom's just a little strict. He nodded slowly, watching me the way only fathers do when they know you're lying but love you enough to let it slide. You hungry? No thanks. I'm exhausted. All right, he said softly. Sleep well, sweetheart. I kissed his cheek before heading to my room. He always smelled like sawdust and coffee, the scent of steady things. From the hallway, I could hear him moving around the kitchen. The clink of a bowl, the creak of the old chair as he sat down at his laptop. I changed into pajamas, brushed my teeth, and paused at the window. Across the courtyard, someone's TV flickered blue. The city hummed with the quiet life of people who didn't know they were lucky. Through the crack in my door, I saw my dad's shadow stretch across the living room. He was staring at his computer screen, his brow furrowed. The faint glow lit the lines on his face. The lines I used to think were from time, but now looked like they'd been carved by something heavier. He clicked, the mouse leaned back and rubbed his eyes. Then he spoke softly, not knowing I could hear. They don't need to know. Not as long as she's happy. I frowned. He typed something, paused, and then his voice again lower. Hayes Capital Partners, portfolio review. My father owned a tiny consulting business. At least that's what he'd always called it. I assumed it meant helping small firms balance budgets or maybe fixing spreadsheets. But the words on his screen, Capital Partners, sounded bigger, heavier. I didn't understand them then, but they would come to mean everything later. He opened a new email. The subject line glowed on the monitor, urgent. Confirm ownership stake. Whitford Hospitality Group. My breath caught. Whitford. The same name I'd been hearing for months. The same family that looked at me like I didn't belong in their air. Dad stared at the message for a long moment, then sighed and pressed delete. The inbox went blank. He sat still for a few seconds, then whispered to himself, no need to complicate her life. I backed away from the door before the floorboards creaked. In bed, I stared at the ceiling, my heart tight. I told myself it was probably a coincidence. Whitford wasn't an uncommon name, and ownership stake didn't mean much to me. I was an architect, not an investor. Still, unease settled deep in my stomach. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Beacon Hill, its spotless streets, its cold marble floors, and of my father sitting alone under their chandeliers, shrinking smaller and smaller while people laughed. Morning came too soon. The smell of coffee drifted through the apartment. My dad was at the table reading the paper, wearing the same flannel shirt he always did on Sundays. He looked peaceful, like last night hadn't happened. "Morning, kiddo," he said with a smile. "Pancakes or oatmeal?" "Coffee's fine," I murmured, pouring a mug. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Jonathan. "Mom wants to invite your dad to the engagement dinner. You should get him ready." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Invite him. The same man she'd barely acknowledged, the same man she'd probably whisper about across the table. I didn't reply. Instead, I looked over at Dad. He was focused on the crossword, muttering clues under his breath. His reading glasses sat crooked on his nose. He looked so calm, so content in his small world. And suddenly the thought of putting him in that room again made me sick. "Dad?" I asked quietly. He looked up, smiling. "Yeah. Do you ever feel like people judge you for not fitting in?" He chuckled. "Honey, I've spent my whole life not fitting in, but I learned something. If they don't see your worth, it's their blindness, not your fault." His words were simple, but they hit harder than he knew. He folded the paper, reaching for his old navy blazer hanging by the chair. "Might have to get this cleaned before the dinner." "Don't want to embarrass you. You could never embarrass me," I said, but my voice cracked. He smiled, smoothing the sleeve. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, a little shiny from years of wear. "Still got a few good nights left in it," he said. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. As I sipped my coffee, the light from the window fell across him. My father, the quiet man who'd built my world from nothing, sitting in his old blazer, humming along to a Sinatra tune. I didn't know it yet, but that image, the serenity, the humility, the peace, was what they would try to shatter next, and it was what would destroy them in the end. The morning of the engagement party started with the sound of my father humming Sinatra off-key. The smell of coffee and starch filled our tiny kitchen. He stood in front of the mirror, struggling with his tie like it was a math problem. "Hold still," I said, stepping behind him. His reflection met mine, both of us smiling at how different we looked. Him, in his worn navy suit, me in the pale blue dress I'd bought on clearance. He chuckled. "You know I don't really fit into places like that, kiddo. You fit anywhere you walk into," I said. "You just don't see it." He looked at me through the mirror, the corner of his mouth lifting. "You sound like your mother." We didn't talk about her often, but every time we did, it made the air softer. I straightened his tie, patted his shoulder, and said, "You look perfect." When we arrived at the Whitford Grand Hotel, I realized I'd underestimated what grand really meant. Marble floors gleamed like water chandeliers, sparkled like galaxies, and every guest looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. My father paused at the door, eyes wide. "Jesus," he whispered. "They probably charge admission just to breathe here." I laughed, but inside I felt my chest tighten. People turned as we entered, their gazes moving from my face to my father's shoes, his suit, his every detail. I heard the whispers before I even found our table. "Who's she with? Is that her father, South Boston, I think?" The words slid through the air like knives. I kept my head high, but my stomach clenched. Eleanor appeared out of nowhere, perfectly composed, a champagne flute in hand. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice sugar-coated but sharp. "How lovely to finally meet you. I've heard you're a consultant." My father smiled easily, extending his hand. "That's right, ma'am. I help people solve problems." "How wonderful," she said, shaking his hand briefly, then turning to a cluster of nearby guests. "Jonathan's father and I do love people who find their purpose in service." Her tone lingered on that last word, just long enough to sting. My dad didn't react. He just nodded and said, "It's honest work." Jonathan appeared beside me. His tie slightly loosened, his smile too bright. "Mom, can we not interrogate people today?" Eleanor's lips curved. "Interrogate, I'm making conversation." Dinner was served in the ballroom, every surface polished to perfection. Jonathan tried to act normal, but his laugh came out too forced, his hand on mine too performative. My father, meanwhile, was calm, polite, even charming when spoken to. When someone asked what he did for a living, he said, "Mostly advising small businesses on how to stay afloat. Numbers strategy, that sort of thing." The man nodded politely, then turned to Eleanor. "A humble profession." Eleanor smiled, her eyes fixed on me. "Yes, he keeps things simple." Jonathan chuckled nervously. "Mom." Later, between the salad and the main course, I leaned close to Jonathan. "You could tell her to stop. She's just being herself," he whispered back. "It's easier to let her talk, easier for who you or me." He didn't answer. When dessert arrived, the table had split into small pockets of conversation. I tried to focus on my father, who was telling a story to one of Jonathan's uncles about rebuilding our old porch. The uncle laughed politely, probably not hearing half of it. I turned to Jonathan and said quietly, "He's amazing, you know. He built everything we had with his hands. He's taught me more about loyalty and decency than anyone." Jonathan's smile faltered. "Yeah, he seems like a good man. Very modest." "Modest," I repeated. "Is that your polite way of saying he's not one of you?" He sighed. "Clara, please. Don't do this here." I leaned back, the sweetness of the champagne turning sour in my mouth. Across the table, Eleanor was laughing with one of her friends, a woman in diamonds who smelled like money. The friend glanced at my father, then whispered something. Eleanor's laugh was soft but cruel. When the music started, people stood moving toward the dance floor. I slipped away for air, walking toward the balcony overlooking the city. Through the glass doors, I could still hear the faint hum of laughter. Then a voice, low but clear. "Eleanor's?" "At least he doesn't dress like a truck driver," she said to her friend. "Small mercies." They both laughed. Jonathan's voice followed, soft or awkward. "Mom, come on. Don't say that. It's just an observation," she replied lightly. "You can't expect me to lie." He chuckled under his breath, that nervous little sound that meant he didn't really disagree. I froze behind one of the marble columns, heart pounding. The cold from the glass seeped through my back, but I couldn't move. When their laughter faded, I slipped out onto the balcony. The Boston skyline shimmered under the night sky, beautiful and indifferent. Below, car lights streaked across the highway like veins of silver. I pressed my palms to the railing, trying to breathe. I'd been so proud to bring my father here, so sure love would outweigh pedigree. Now all I could feel was shame. Shame for them. For him, for me. Inside, the music swelled violins carrying a melody too elegant for how small I suddenly felt. When my father found me 10 minutes later, he didn't ask why my eyes were red. He just placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Ready to go home, kiddo?" I nodded. He smiled. "You looked beautiful tonight. Your mother would have said so too." I swallowed hard. "Thanks, Dad." As we left, I glanced back at the glittering ballroom, the place where laughter was currency and kindness was poverty. The moment Jonathan's eyes met mine across the room, he looked away. I didn't cry until we got to the parking lot, and even then I made sure my father didn't hear. When the car door closed, the sound echoed like a verdict. When the person you love doesn't defend you, silence becomes a sharper knife than any word. A week before the wedding, Eleanor called me to the Whitford house to finalize details. Her assistant's voice on the phone had been cheerful, but the request itself felt like a summons. When I arrived that afternoon, the house smelled of jasmine tea and polished wood. Jonathan was already there, sitting stiffly on the edge of a velvet sofa, his tie loosened. Eleanor poured tea into delicate china cups, her posture perfect, her movements slow and deliberate. "Clara, dear," she began, setting the pot down with a soft clink. "We need to discuss something important." My stomach tightened. "Of course." She folded her hands in her lap. "We're expecting about 200 guests. Senators, business partners, some friends from the Boston Symphony. It will be quite the event." "I know," I said. "I've been finalizing the seating plan with the coordinator." "Yes, about that." She took a breath, eyes flicking toward Jonathan before returning to me. "I think we should consider whether your father will be comfortable in that environment." "Comfortable?" I asked. "What do you mean?" She smiled gently, the kind of smile people give when they're about to insult you but want to look gracious doing it. "It's not that I don't want him there, of course not. I just worry it might be overwhelming for him. So many people, such a formal setting. So you think my father doesn't belong there?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. "Mom just means maybe we should think about how everything will look. You know, the photos, the press. She's trying to protect the image of the event." I turned to him. "The image. You think a photo matters more than respect." He avoided my eyes. "You're twisting it. I'm clarifying it." The silence that followed was heavy. Eleanor looked at Jonathan as if urging him to take control, but he only sank further into his seat. I stood up. "For months, I've let you both make me feel small. I smiled through your little jokes, your backhanded compliments. But this... You're asking me to be ashamed of my father." Eleanor's smile never faltered. "Clara, don't be dramatic. No one's ashamed. We just want what's best for you." "What's best for me," I said. is marrying someone who stands up for me. Jonathan finally looked at me, his voice barely above a whisper. Please, let's not do this now. I grabbed my purse. You're right. Let's not. I walked out before either of them could speak again. The cool air outside hit my face like a slap. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my car keys. Behind me, I heard the front door open. Clara. Jonathan called. I didn't turn around. I got in the car, started the engine, and drove away. The entire ride home, I fought the urge to cry, swallowing it down until my throat burned. By the time I reached our apartment, the sun had dipped below the skyline, painting the city in dusky orange. I saw my father through the window, sitting at the kitchen table, reading the paper with his glasses low on his nose. The sight of him, simple, steady, kind, was enough to break whatever wall I'd built inside me. He looked up as I came in. Hey, sweetheart, you look tired. I'm fine, I said, dropping my purse on the counter. My voice cracked. No, I'm not. He stood, concern softening his face. What happened? I shook my head, tears spilling before I could stop them. I can't do it, Dad. I can't pretend anymore. They look at you like you're beneath them, like I should be embarrassed. He crossed the room and pulled me into his arms. His hands were warm, rough from years of work. Don't you ever feel ashamed of me? Not for 1 second. I'm not ashamed of you. I said, my voice muffled against his chest. I'm ashamed that I let them make me feel like I should be. He held me tighter. No one can make you small unless you let them. I closed my eyes. The sound of his heartbeat steadied mine. When I finally pulled away, he smiled that quiet, tired smile I'd known my whole life. You're stronger than you think, kiddo. He walked to the counter and poured us both coffee. The rich smell filled the room. From his wallet, he pulled out a silver card, the edges gleaming under the kitchen light. What's that? I asked, wiping my face. He glanced at it almost sheepishly. Work stuff. Old habit, I guess. I reached out and took it. And the metal was cool heavy. The engraved letters read Hayes Capital Partners, Executive Access. I frowned. You never told me you worked for a firm. I don't really, he said, easing the card from my fingers. I just help a few people avoid financial mistakes. So, consulting? Something like that. He slipped the card back into his wallet. You don't need to worry about it. I leaned against the counter studying him. Why do I feel like that's not the whole story? He laughed softly. Because you're my daughter. You always know when I'm holding something back. We both smiled, but there was something in his eyes, a shadow I couldn't name. He handed me my coffee and raised his cup. To letting go of people who don't see you for who you are. I clinked my mug against his. To that, later, as I changed for bed, I noticed something shiny in my coat pocket. The card. He must have slipped it in there when I wasn't looking. I turned it over in my hand, tracing the engraved name. Hayes Capital Partners. The words meant nothing to me then, but I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe because it felt like proof that my father's world was bigger than I'd ever realized. I slipped the card into the drawer of my nightstand before turning off the light. If I'd known what it represented, what it would eventually reveal, I would have held it tighter that night. Instead, I closed my eyes, unaware that I had just tucked away the biggest secret of my life. June sunlight spilled across the Whitford Grand like something rehearsed. Every window shimmered, every orchid glowed white against the marble, and for a moment I wondered if perfection could be suffocating. The makeup artist pressed powder under my eyes. Almost done, she said. Her brush smelled like lavender and nerves. Melissa, my maid of honor and oldest friend, leaned against the vanity, arms crossed. You sure you want to go through with this? I looked at her reflection, at her raised eyebrow, and the kind of honesty only a best friend could get away with. It's a little late to change my mind, don't you think? She shrugged. There's always time to walk away. Melissa, I whispered. I've already given them everything. I can't back out now. Why not? She asked softly. You deserve better than a man who lets his mother talk down to your father. I didn't answer. The stylist pinned the last piece of my hair, and I forced a smile at my reflection. It's one day, I said. Then things will calm down. She didn't look convinced. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Jonathan. Don't let your dad stress himself out today. I stared at the words. Don't let your dad stress himself out. Not, I can't wait to see you. Not, I love you. Just another subtle reminder of how my family didn't fit. Melissa peeked at the screen and sighed. Charming. I locked my phone without replying. Let's just get through this. The ceremony started at noon. The ballroom was a cathedral of crystal and sound, violins tuning waiters, whispering, hundreds of guests shifting in their seats. From behind the double doors, I could see flashes of silverware, white suits, expensive smiles. When the coordinator gave the signal, I stepped out, bouquet trembling in my hands. My father was supposed to walk me down the aisle, but Eleanor had insisted on something more modern. So I walked alone. The crowd rose. I kept my eyes forward, pretending not to notice the curious glances, the whispered comments about South Boston, about the bride who wasn't from the right kind of family. Then I saw him. At the far end of the room near the back, my father sat at a small round table by the service entrance. His suit was dark navy, a little too heavy for June, the fabric shining where it had worn thin over time. He looked proud, though sitting up straight, his smile steady. He lifted his hand in a small wave when our eyes met. For a second, everything else disappeared. Then, Eleanor's voice cut through my focus. "Clara, dear, the photographers are waiting. We'll take the VIP pictures before the ceremony." I blinked, pulled back to reality. "I just want to say hi to my dad." Her manicured hand brushed my arm, lightly firm underneath the politeness. "Later. We don't want to keep the senator waiting." Before I could protest, she was already leading me toward the front of the hall. Victoria, Jonathan's younger sister, stood nearby, phone in hand, smile sharp as glass. "So sweet," she murmured. "She really thinks her dad's part of the big moment." I heard it. She wanted me to hear it. Eleanor adjusted the train of my dress. "Smile, dear. The guests are watching." So I smiled. I smiled until my jaw ached. The flashbulbs went off, and every time they did, I caught sight of my father in the reflection of the mirrors along the wall, sitting alone, clapping politely, invisible among the glittering crowd. The officiant's voice boomed, signaling everyone to take their seats. I took Jonathan's hand as he joined me at the altar. His palm was cool, slightly damp. "You look beautiful," he whispered. I wanted to believe him, but when the music swelled, and I glanced toward his mother, she wasn't watching me. She was watching my father, eyes narrowed, mouth curved in a faint smirk. The ceremony moved quickly, a blur of vows and rehearsed words. When it came time for Jonathan to say "I do," he smiled confidently. When it was my turn, my voice cracked, but I forced it out. Applause followed, hollow and polite. At the reception, everything glittered too much. Eleanor had spared no expense. 12-piece orchestra imported caviar champagne fountains. It was perfect and it was miserable. Scone. I looked for my father again. He was still at the same table now, surrounded by waiters carrying trays of champagne. He sat quietly, sipping water, the untouched plate of food in front of him. I took a step in his direction, but before I could move, Eleanor appeared again. "Clara, darling, the governor wants a picture with the newlyweds. Let's not keep him waiting." "I'll just be a minute," I said. "Nonsense." She looped her arm through mine. "Your father understands." "He's fine." Her tone was final. I caught Jonathan's eye silently pleading for help, but he was already walking toward a cluster of businessmen shaking hands and laughing like the perfect host. I swallowed hard and followed Eleanor. Hours blurred together. Introductions, speeches, the clinking of glasses. I smiled through every photo, every compliment that wasn't really a compliment. "You've done so well for yourself," one guest said. "It's nice to see someone from humble beginnings make it here." "Thank you," I said through gritted teeth. By the time the dinner ended, I could barely feel my face from holding the same expression. Then, as the orchestra prepared for the first dance, the MC took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "please welcome our bride and groom, Jonathan Whitford and Clara Hayes, a proud daughter of South Boston." The room filled with polite applause, but beneath it came the murmurs, "South Boston." "I thought she was from Cambridge." "Oh, that explains the accent." Each whisper landed like a pinprick. I stepped forward, my hand trembling in Jonathan's. The music began, something classical, distant, beautiful, and we moved slowly across the floor. Over his shoulder I saw Eleanor watching us, smiling faintly satisfied, and beside her my father, clapping small and proud. Jonathan leaned close and whispered, "Relax. Everyone's watching." I pulled back just enough to see his face. He was smiling for the cameras, not for me. And in that instant I knew exactly which side he'd chosen. The violins swelled, the lights glowed, and every eye was on us. Voiceover. I thought I'd gotten used to their contempt, but on my wedding day it wasn't hidden anymore. It was dressed in diamonds and applause. When the song ended, the crowd erupted in cheers. I curtsied slightly, forcing one last smile, and the MC's voice rose above the clapping. "Let's hear it for our beautiful bride." From South Boston. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel enough to be obvious, but I felt it anyway. My chest tightened. I looked toward the back of the room. My father raised his glass to me, smiling like nothing was wrong. And that was the moment I realized he was protecting me even now. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and clapped along with everyone else, pretending not to feel the walls closing in. After the first dance, the lights dimmed, and Eleanor Whitford glided onto the stage like she was accepting an award. The orchestra quieted. The chatter died instantly. She took the microphone from the MC, her diamonds catching every bit of light in the room. "Good evening," she began, her voice smooth as cream. "I want to thank all 200 of you for being here tonight to celebrate our family. It means the world to us." Her eyes swept the room, pausing just long enough on each important guest to make them feel personally acknowledged. Then she turned toward me and Jonathan, smiling. "We are so proud of our son, Jonathan, and of course," she placed a hand on her heart, "we're also thrilled to welcome Clara, who has overcome so much to stand here with us today." The applause was polite but thin. I caught a murmur from the front row, from South Boston. "Right? She's done well for herself," another voice replied. "She must be very determined." Eleanor tilted her head in mock modesty. "Yes, indeed. Determined. It takes courage to adapt, doesn't it?" A soft ripple of laughter spread through the room. I felt my throat tighten. I glanced toward Jonathan, hoping he'd notice, hoping he'd stop it before it went further. Instead, he stared at the floor, his jaw tight but unmoving. Eleanor continued pacing slowly across the stage, every word deliberate. "You know, we come from a long line of tradition in this family. Certain values, certain standards, but I've always believed that if someone truly tries, they can find their place anywhere." Her tone was syrupy sweet. Victoria stood off to the side, phone raised, filming everything. When she caught my eye, she winked and mouthed, "Smile." I didn't. Eleanor turned her attention toward the back of the ballroom. "And speaking of trying, I must say how admirable it is to see Mr. Hayes here tonight, Clara's father." Everyone. The spotlight shifted toward my father. He froze, then stood politely, giving a small nod. A few people clapped, most didn't. Eleanor's voice softened, dripping with false praise. "He raised his daughter alone, I hear. That's no small feat." My father smiled faintly. "Ever gracious. Just did what any parent would, ma'am." "How lovely," she said. "And you came all the way here, didn't you?" It must be quite an experience being in a room like this. My chest went cold. Someone near the front whispered, "She means he doesn't belong." Another guest chuckled. "He looks like a man who fixes things. Is he in maintenance?" Eleanor clasped her hands together, pretending not to hear. "It's so inspiring, isn't it, to see someone so unpretentious among us." A man at one of the corporate tables leaned to his wife. "Unpretentious. She means broke." Laughter broke out, muffled but spreading like wildfire. Eleanor gave a tiny shrug. "I never said that, but, well, we all see what we see." The laughter grew louder this time. Even the orchestra members exchanged glances. My father didn't move. His face remained calm, but I saw the faint tremor in his hand on the table. I turned to Jonathan. "Stop her," I whispered. "Please." He kept his eyes forward. "She's just nervous. You know how she gets. Nervous." My voice cracked. "She's humiliating him. Clara," he hissed under his breath. "Don't make a scene." I stared at him, disbelief freezing me in place. His lips twitched in something between a grimace and a smile, the same expression he always wore when pretending everything was fine. Eleanor smiled wider, sensing no one would stop her. "Really, Mr. Hayes, it's remarkable what you've accomplished, raising a daughter who's climbed so high. We're all very impressed." Victoria's phone zoomed in on his face. I could see her reflection in the mirror behind the stage, smiling as she recorded. Eleanor leaned closer to the microphone. "Still, perhaps this setting isn't exactly familiar, is it? We wouldn't want you to feel out of place." There were more laughs now, bolder ones. A woman covered her mouth, trying to hide her amusement. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. My father remained seated, his back straight, dignity intact despite the laughter circling him. And then, Eleanor said it, "This is a wedding after all. Not a truck stop." She paused, savoring the discomfort she caused. "But truly, it's touching to see you here, Mr. Hayes. I mean, not everyone gets invited to such events. That's not a father, though." Her voice dropped venom quiet, but unmistakable. "That's trash." For a moment, the world stopped moving. Every sound in the ballroom vanished. The clinking glasses, the laughter, even the orchestra's hum. The only thing I could hear was my own breath, sharp and ragged. My father didn't speak. He didn't flinch. But I saw his fingers tighten around his glass, the faintest tremor betraying him. A waiter froze mid-step, his tray shaking. Someone gasped. A nervous laugh tried to break through and failed. Eleanor smiled, satisfied with the silence she'd created. And then Jonathan chuckled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but I heard it. I felt it. That tiny sound snapped something in me I didn't know had been holding all this time. I looked at him, my husband, the man I thought would protect me, and in that instant I knew we were already over. The humiliation, the pitying stares, the recorded whispers, they all blurred into a single moment of unbearable clarity. I stood my chair, scraping across the marble floor, loud and final. My hands shook, but my voice didn't. "Enough!" Eleanor turned slowly, her smile faltering for the first time. I stepped forward, my pulse pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. The crowd parted like they could sense what was coming. My father rose too, placing a hand over mine, steadying me. His voice was calm. "Clara, sweetheart." But I couldn't stop now. My whole body was on fire, every humiliation, every insult converging into one word echoing in my head: trash. I looked at Eleanor, at Jonathan, at every person in that gilded room who had laughed and said quietly, "You'll regret this." Eleanor tilted her chin, eyes flashing with condescension. "Don't embarrass yourself, dear." And that was the moment I decided I wouldn't. Not anymore. The silence before the storm hung heavy in the air, waiting for the next breath to break it. The air in the ballroom turned solid. 200 guests froze in their seats. Forks suspended mid-air, champagne glasses trembling in uncertain hands. Even the orchestra stopped playing the final note, hanging in the air like smoke that refused to fade. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, loud and uneven. Eleanor still stood at the microphone, her expression frozen in the shape of a smile. The word she'd said, trash, still echoed across the marble. No one dared breathe. A woman in the front row shifted uncomfortably. A man coughed to fill the silence, but even that sounded like a sin. I looked around. Rows of expensive dresses, tuxedos, diamonds catching the light. Some faces looked horrified. Others entertained. A few people smiled faintly like this was theater, and I was the next act. And then I looked at Jonathan. He was standing beside me, his face pale under the chandelier's glow. For a fleeting second, I believed he'd say something, that he'd take the microphone and shut it all down. But he didn't. Instead, his lips curved, not into a full smile, but a quiet, cowardly smirk, the kind of laugh people use when they're afraid to stand alone. That sound shattered whatever was left inside me. My chair scraped loudly against the marble as I stood. The noise snapped the room's fragile silence in half. "You just insulted the man who made it possible for me to stand here today," I said, my voice trembling but sharp. Eleanor turned towards me slowly, her eyes cool and mocking. "Oh, sweetheart, don't be so dramatic. It was just a little joke. Everyone here knows that." I stepped forward, every nerve in my body shaking. "No one jokes by calling someone trash." She started to laugh, but it caught in her throat when I reached for the microphone. I yanked it out of her hand. The sound of the feedback screeched through the speakers, making several guests flinch. "Let me be very clear," I said, my voice cutting through the room. "That man over there," I pointed to my father still sitting in the back corner, his hands folded neatly on the table, "is the most decent human being I know. He worked himself to the bone to raise me alone, to give me a life your money could never buy, Clara." Jonathan hissed, grabbing my arm. "Stop! You're making a scene." I turned to him. My voice low enough for only him to hear. "You laughed. What?" "When she called my father trash, you laughed." "It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that." The crowd murmured, shifting in their seats, drawn like moths to the flames they knew were about to spread. I turned back to Eleanor. "You wanted a show, didn't you?" "Here it is." She reached for the microphone again, but I stepped back, my grip firm. I spent 18 months pretending I belonged here, I said, trying to prove I was enough for your son, enough for your family. But today I realized belonging in your world isn't something to be proud of. Gasps rippled through the guests. Someone whispered, "She's losing it," and someone else said, "Good for her." Jonathan's face flushed red. "Clara, please," he muttered. "We'll talk about this later." There's nothing left to talk about. I slid the wedding ring off my finger. The platinum caught the light cold and heavy. For a moment I looked at it, at everything it represented, everything I'd convinced myself I wanted. "I'm done," I said. Jonathan's voice cracked. "You can't. I already did." The ring hit the marble floor with a sharp metallic crack that echoed through the ballroom. The sound seemed to linger forever, like it was etching itself into the walls. I turned away from the stage, every step heavier than the last. My heart pounded. My vision blurring at the edges, and then I heard the soft scrape of a chair behind me. My father. He stood calm and quiet, his presence filling the room without a word. The guests parted instinctively as he made his way toward me. He didn't look at Eleanor. He didn't look at Jonathan. He only looked at me. When he reached me, he placed one hand gently on my shoulder. "Sweetheart," he said softly. "You did the right thing." I swallowed hard, my throat burning. He turned toward the crowd, his expression composed. "You'll all realize one day what you lost here tonight." His voice was low, but carried easily the kind of authority that demanded attention, without ever asking for it. Eleanor's lips tightened. "How dare you speak to us like a man who's spent his life being underestimated," he interrupted. "I've had worse." He looked back at me, pride flickering behind the calm. "Let's go, Clara." As we turned to leave, Eleanor stepped forward, her composure slipping just enough to show the panic beneath. "You'll regret this," she hissed, the words sharp and venomous. I stopped just long enough to meet her eyes. "No," I said, my voice steady now. "You will." The whispers followed us as we walked down the aisle between the tables. A few guests stared in stunned silence. Others avoided our gaze, pretending to fix their napkins, unwilling to risk being caught in the fallout. The doors to the ballroom swung open, and cool air rushed in from the hallway, washing over me like freedom. The sound of the orchestra restarting, too soon, too cheerful, faded behind us. Outside, the lobby was quiet, the marble floors gleaming under soft light. My father stopped near the exit and turned to me. "You okay?" I tried to answer but couldn't. The tears I'd been holding back broke free, silent and hot. He didn't say another word, just pulled me into his arms and held me until my breathing steadied. When I finally stepped back, I looked at him. His worn suit, his kind eyes, the quiet strength that money couldn't buy. And I knew he'd never needed defending. He'd only ever wanted me to see my own worth. As we walked out into the night, I heard the muffled buzz of conversation behind us, phones snapping, cameras flashing, people recording what they thought was a scandal. They didn't know they were recording the end of a lie. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I'd already seen enough. For a few seconds after I walked out, the ballroom behind me was silent. Then I heard it, a single gasp followed by the low rumble of people whispering. The air shifted, charged and restless. I turned halfway just in time to see my father step forward. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. He simply walked back toward the stage, the crowd parting instinctively, as though they could feel something in the room change. The spotlight caught his face, calm, unreadable, and far too composed for a man who'd just been humiliated in front of 200 people. He stopped at the microphone Eleanor had dropped. His voice was steady, quiet, but carrying. "I wasn't planning to say anything tonight," he said. "But maybe it's time the truth came out." People leaned forward. I could see Eleanor stiffen, her painted smile faltering for the first time. "Mr. Hayes," she began. "I don't think—" He turned toward her, his tone sharper. "You called me trash, didn't you?" She blinked, caught between indignation and fear. "I think this conversation has gone far enough." "No," he said softly. "It hasn't even started." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim black folder. "You called me trash," he repeated. "That's interesting, because I'm the man who saved your company 15 years ago." The room erupted into gasps. Even the waitstaff froze, eyes darting between them. I saw Jonathan's head snap toward my father, confusion painted across his face. "Dad?" he stammered. "What are you talking about?" My father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the entrance. Theo. A moment later, a tall man in a gray suit stepped through the double doors carrying a briefcase. His polished shoes clicked against the marble as he approached the stage. He set the briefcase down, opened it, and took out a set of documents. "My name is Theodore Blake," he said, his voice crisp. "Legal counsel for Hayes Capital Partners." He handed the papers to Harold Whitford, who was already standing now, his face the color of chalk. "These," Theodore continued, "are official filings from the Securities and Exchange Commission. They confirm that Hayes Capital Partners holds a 31% ownership stake in Whitford Hospitality Group." A collective intake of breath swept the room. Jonathan's voice broke through the chaos. "You're saying," Harold interrupted, whispering, "My gosh, he's the silent partner." My father nodded. "The one you never bothered to learn about because you assumed he couldn't afford to matter." The crowd buzzed like static. Eleanor stumbled backward, her heel catching the edge of the stage. "That's not possible," she whispered. "We've never had an outsider," my father finished for her. "You did. You just never knew his name." I felt the world tilt. Everything I'd thought I understood about him, the modest apartment, the flannel shirts, the pickup truck, suddenly looked like camouflage. He looked out at the audience, then at me. 15 years ago, this family's company was 48 hours from bankruptcy. I invested quietly, $200 million, to keep it alive. Not for profit, for potential. I believed in people more than pedigree. The murmurs grew louder. Camera flashes burst through the crowd. Someone whispered, "He's the investor from the 2009 bailout." Jonathan stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" My father smiled faintly. "Because I didn't need your approval, and because I wanted my daughter to be loved for who she is, not for what I own." Tears pricked my eyes. "Dad." I whispered, "I didn't know." He looked at me, the lines around his eyes softening. "You weren't supposed to. You had to find your own worth first." He turned back to Eleanor, who had sunk into a chair, her perfect posture gone. "You said I don't belong in this room," he said quietly. "But without me, there wouldn't be a room for any of you to stand in." Someone in the back clapped tentatively at first, then another. Within seconds, half the guests were applauding. The rest sat frozen, unsure whether to join or hide. Eleanor's lipstick had smudged. Her breathing was shallow. "You think this makes you better than us?" she snapped. He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just better than what you were tonight." Victoria lowered her phone, her expression a mix of disbelief and panic. "Mom." She whispered you should stop talking, but it was too late. Every camera in the room was already pointed at her, every phone recording, every lens catching the image of a woman who'd just destroyed her own family's reputation. My father took a step closer to me. "Come on, Clara. Let's go." I hesitated, still trembling. "You're sure?" He smiled gently. "I've never been more sure." As we turned to leave, I glanced back one last time. Eleanor was sitting with her hands in her lap, staring at nothing. Jonathan was beside her, his head in his hands. Victoria sat motionless, her phone still recording its red light, blinking like a heartbeat. And in that frozen image, I saw everything. Wealth, power, and fear. Crumbling under the weight of a truth they couldn't control. As we walked through the doors, the murmurs turned into chaos. Recruiters shouting guests, scrambling flashes exploding behind us. But I didn't stop. My father's voice echoed in my head. "Dignity doesn't need money to exist. It needs courage to be shown." Outside, the night air felt cold and clean. For the first time in years, I could breathe. 2 days after the wedding, the world found out. The video hit TikTok first. A 30-second clip of Eleanor Whitford standing on stage, her pearls gleaming under the chandeliers, her voice sharp and deliberate. "That's not a father. That's trash." The internet devoured it. 2 million views in 24 hours. #WeddingTrash climbed to the top of the trending list before noon. Morning talk shows picked it up, looping the same footage over and over, dissecting it like a public trial. "Imagine humiliating someone like that," one host said. "And then finding out he's the billionaire who saved your company," another chimed in. "It's poetic justice, honestly. You can't write this kind of karma." I watched the videos in silence, sitting cross-legged on my couch, my phone screen glowing in the dim light of my apartment. The comments flooded in beneath every repost. "She's a hero. That's what self-respect looks like. Money doesn't buy class. Finally, a real-life fairy tale where the good people win." My face was on half the thumbnails. My voice, cracking as I said, "No one jokes by calling someone trash," was turned into a meme, a rallying cry. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt nothing. The more I scrolled, the emptier I became. Each compliment, each declaration of support felt like an echo that didn't belong to me. I wasn't brave. I'd just reached a breaking point. After an hour, I locked the screen and tossed the phone onto the couch. The apartment was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window pane. A knock came at the door. My father stepped in holding a folded newspaper. His suit jacket was damp from the drizzle. "You've seen it," he asked. "Everyone's seen it," I said. He handed me the paper. The headline on the front page of the Boston Globe read, "Whitford Empire, Shaken by Wedding Scandal." Underneath was a photo of Eleanor mid-speech, mouth open, eyes full of venom. Beside her, Jonathan's face was frozen in disbelief. I stared at it for a long time. "Are you okay?" my father asked finally. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm not happy they're falling apart, if that's what you mean, but I'm glad I didn't stay silent." He nodded slowly. "That's what matters." He set the paper on the table and poured himself coffee. For a while, neither of us spoke. The world outside our apartment buzzed with outrage and fascination. But here, everything was still. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, the Whitford offices were chaos. Reporters crowded the lobby. Employees avoided the cameras. Jonathan's name had already been removed from the company's leadership page. The board had voted to suspend him indefinitely, citing ethical concerns and reputational risk. Eleanor had vanished. No one knew where she was. Some said she'd fled to their vacation home in Cape Cod. Others claimed she'd checked into a private clinic. Harold stayed behind, trying to hold the company together as contracts evaporated one by one. I didn't need to read about it to know. People like them always crumble under their own weight when the facade cracks. 2 nights later, my father received an invitation to a press conference. He didn't want to go, but Theodore insisted. "The media's writing their own version of the story," he said over the phone. "You should tell yours." The next morning, we drove to the small conference room at the Hayes Capital offices downtown. A dozen reporters waited, recorders ready. My father took his seat at the front, calm as ever. One of the journalists, a woman from the Boston Herald, raised her hand. "Mr. Hayes, do you regret keeping your identity a secret for so long?" He smiled faintly. "No, I regret assuming that everyone understands the value of respect." Another reporter asked, "Why didn't you reveal yourself earlier, before the wedding?" He looked directly at her. "Because I wanted my daughter to be judged for who she is, not for who I am." Unfortunately, that experiment failed. Flashbulbs popped. Pens scratched against paper. Someone else called out, "What happens to the Whitfords now? Will you withdraw your investment?" My father took a long breath, folding his hands on the table. "That's not a decision made in anger," he said. "We'll handle it through the board. But I'll tell you this, actions have consequences. Some of them just take longer to arrive." When it was over, he stood, shook Theodore's hand, and walked past the cameras, without another word. Outside, as we stepped into the cool afternoon, I asked quietly, "Do you think this will ever stop? The videos? The noise, the people treating it like entertainment?" He looked at me with that calm half-smile again. "Eventually. Outrage burns fast. Dignity lasts longer." That night I sat on my bed scrolling through my messages again. There were hundreds, journalists, strangers, people thanking me for standing up for working-class families. I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I opened the one message I hadn't yet read. It was from Jonathan. I didn't know. I swear I didn't. Please believe me. I stared at it for a long time, then typed. "You didn't have to know who my father was to know what was right." I deleted it before sending. The phone buzzed again, more notifications pouring in, more likes, more comments, more noise. I turned it face down and lay back against the pillow. Through the window, I could see the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. The rain had started again, soft and steady, washing the streets clean. Karma doesn't arrive in thunder or applause. It comes quietly in the silence that follows a fall. And in that silence, I finally felt something close to peace. By the end of that summer, the scandal that had shaken Boston society found its way into the courtroom. Eleanor Whitford had filed a defamation suit against my father. Character assassination, she called it. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The case drew cameras like moths to a flame. Reporters lined the steps of the Suffolk County Courthouse, shouting questions that no one intended to answer. I sat behind my father in the gallery watching him adjust his tie with the same calmness he carried into every storm. He looked sharp in a charcoal gray suit, his silver hair neatly combed, a pair of reading glasses resting in his hand. He could have been mistaken for one of the lawyers. Beside him, Theodore Blake arranged folders on the defense table, methodical and unbothered. Eleanor arrived 10 minutes late, flanked by her attorney and the flash of cameras. Even in disgrace, she carried herself like royalty. Pearl earrings, cream blazer, the same practiced posture. But there was something off. The confidence that once filled every room she entered now looked forced, brittle around the edges. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Elaine Porter was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no patience for spectacle. She'd presided over corporate fraud cases, political scandals, and messy divorces, but this one, it seemed, was personal for the city. The proceedings began. Eleanor's lawyer stood first, his voice smooth. "Your Honor, my client's reputation has suffered irreparable harm due to Mr. Hayes's statements, which were made publicly and without regard for their impact." The judge cut him off. "You mean the statements regarding ownership in Whitford Hospitality?" He cleared his throat. "Precisely. Mrs. Whitford contends that the manner in which those revelations were presented, particularly at a private event, constituted humiliation and intentional damage." The judge glanced at my father. "Mr. Hayes, how do you respond?" He rose slowly. "By telling the truth, Your Honor, and by defending my daughter." Eleanor scoffed audibly. "Defending her by ruining me." The judge's gavel hit once. "Mrs. Whitford, you will remain silent unless addressed." The room tensed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Theodore stood next, his tone precise. "Your Honor, my client revealed nothing that wasn't already documented in federal records. Hayes' Capital Partners' stake in Whitford Hospitality has been public knowledge since 2009, filed with the SEC. Furthermore, Mrs. Whitford's comments at the wedding were not merely unkind. They were defamatory, recorded by multiple guests, and have since been verified by audio analysis." He clicked a remote, and a screen lit up behind him. The video played, the ballroom Eleanor on stage, her voice slicing through the speakers. "That's not a father. That's trash." The words hung in the courtroom like smoke. Every person in that room flinched, even those who had already seen it. The judge's expression didn't change. She only said, "Play it again." It played again. My heart pounded the same way it had that night. When the clip ended, Theodore turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, the defense contends that Mrs. Whitford's downfall was self-inflicted. Mr. Hayes's disclosure merely corrected a false narrative, one she herself created." The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Mrs. Whitford, did you make those remarks?" Eleanor straightened her chin high. "It was taken out of context." What context, the judge asked dryly, would make calling someone trash acceptable? Eleanor's lips parted, but no sound came out. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the clicking of pens stopped. After a long pause, Judge Porter said, "You've accused this man of defamation, yet it appears you're the author of your own reputation's destruction." She turned her gaze toward Eleanor's lawyer. "The court finds no merit in this claim. The suit is dismissed." The gavel struck once more. Case closed. A rush of whispers filled the room. Reporters sprinted for the exits to get the story out first. Eleanor's attorney whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. Her face was pale, her eyes unfocused, as if she couldn't believe her world had finally stopped bending to her will. I stood, the weight in my chest loosening for the first time in months. My father thanked Theodore quietly, then turned to me. "You okay?" "I am now," I said. When we stepped into the hallway, the flash of cameras hit us instantly. My father raised a hand politely, but didn't speak. Then, from the crowd, a voice called out, "Mr. Hayes, do you regret keeping your identity a secret?" He paused just long enough to answer, "I only regret assuming everyone understood the value of respect." The reporters fell silent, and for a moment so did the cameras. I spotted Jonathan near the corner, standing awkwardly by a column. His hair was shorter, his face thinner. When he saw me, he stepped forward. "Clara." I hesitated, then stopped. "What do you want?" His voice cracked. "I'm sorry. For all of it. I should have stood up for you. For him." "You had the chance," I said quietly. "Silence was your choice." He nodded, his eyes downcast. I know. I walked past him without another word. Some lessons come too late to matter. Outside the courthouse, my father paused at the top of the steps. A boy selling newspapers stood near the curb, his hands red from the cold. Dad pulled a $10 bill from his pocket, took a paper, and tucked it into his coat. The boy looked up at him wide-eyed. Thanks, mister. My father smiled. Keep the change. Eleanor exited moments later, avoiding the reporters. Her driver held the car door open, but she didn't get in immediately. She froze for just a second, watching my father talk to that kid, the corners of her mouth twitching. Guilt, recognition, maybe both. When she finally climbed into the car, her reflection caught mine through the window. Her eyes were tired. For the first time, she looked human. As the car pulled away, I stood beside my father on the courthouse steps. The late summer wind lifting the edges of the newspaper in his hands. The headline read, "Case dismissed. Truth wins quietly." It wasn't the ruling that broke Eleanor. It was realizing the truth had been there all along. Too bright, too undeniable, and impossible to run from. 6 months later, Boston was buried under winter. The air smelled of snow and salt, and the city moved slower, quieter, as if it was finally catching its breath after a long storm. That morning, I sat in my new office, a modest space on the corner of Tremont and Shawmut, with exposed brick and a view of the park below. On my desk, a fresh copy of the Boston Globe lay open. The headline wasn't about scandals this time. It was a letter, a full-page letter signed by Eleanor Whitford. I once believed my status gave me the right to judge others. It began. I was wrong. True worth has nothing to do with where one sits at the table, but how one treats those seated beside them. I read the words twice. Her handwriting, now printed in looping script across newsprint, felt like a confession whispered too late. My father had left the paper on my desk before heading to a board meeting. He didn't say a word about it. He didn't need to. The photo beside the article showed Eleanor in a gray coat, her hair pulled back, simply no makeup, no pearls. Just a woman who looked tired. I traced a finger along the headline and exhaled. Maybe she finally understood. Maybe. Outside my window, crews were finishing the last touches on Hayes Park, the first project my firm had completed under its new name, Hayes Green Spaces. Benches had been sanded smooth, the playground polished, the fountain wrapped in winter protection until spring. The sign at the entrance gleamed, designed by Clara Hayes. My phone buzzed. Melissa popped her head in before I could answer. "You're on in 10, she said, holding a clipboard and grinning. "I still can't believe it's happening," I said. "Believe it," she replied. "Boston's about to get a park that doesn't smell like exhaust fumes. You did it." She straightened the scarf around my neck the same way she used to before college presentations and smiled. "Let's go." We walked out together into the crisp air. The sky was pale blue, the kind that only winter could manage. Cold, but bright. City officials gathered by the podium. My father stood near the fountain talking to the mayor, his breath misting in the air. He caught my eye and gave a small nod. When the ceremony began, Melissa stepped up first to speak. "What you see here isn't just a park," she said. "It's a symbol of rebuilding, of what happens when people choose to create instead of destroy." Then it was my turn. The microphone felt warm in my hands despite the chill. "I grew up a few blocks from here," I said, my voice echoing softly. "This neighborhood taught me that you don't need to be rich to be proud of where you come from. You just need to care enough to make it better." Applause spread through the crowd, gentle but heartfelt. As I stepped back, my eyes caught a figure standing at the edge of the gathering. Eleanor. She wore that same gray coat from the photo buttoned high against the wind. No entourage, no photographers. She carried a small wreath of white lilies. Slowly she approached the park entrance, knelt before the sign, and set the wreath down. Pinned to it was a card. From where I stood, I could barely make out the words. But I didn't need to. When the wind turned, the card fluttered enough for me to read the handwriting I recognized instantly. "Thank you for teaching me the most expensive lesson of my life." My breath caught. No one else seemed to notice her. Not the mayor, not the crowd. She stood quietly for a moment, then straightened, brushing snow from her gloves. She looked up, and for the briefest instant our eyes met. She didn't smile. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then turned and began to walk away. Her steps slow but steady. The gray coat blended into the crowd until she was just another figure crossing Tremont Street, Anonymous, unremarkable, absorbed into the rhythm of the city she used to own. Beside me, Melissa whispered, "Was that?" "Yes," I said softly. "It was." We both fell silent. My father stepped to my side, his hands in his pockets. "You saw her?" I nodded. "She left a wreath." He studied the park sign, then said quietly, "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting." I glanced at him. "I know. It means you don't let the pain decide who you become." I looked out over the park. The rows of benches, the children running near the frozen pond, the plaque with my name beneath his foundation's logo, and I realized he was right. That night, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, the park lights came on for the first time. They glowed soft and golden, reflecting off the snow. Families lingered to take photos, their laughter filling the air. I stood by the gate long after everyone had left. The lilies Eleanor had placed were already gathering frost, but they still looked pure against the darkening ground. People would forget the scandal eventually. The internet would move on. The Whitfords would fade into business pages and gossip archives. But this park, this small piece of green in the middle of winter, would stay. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about her. It was about peace. And peace, like the first snow, falls quietly when you're finally ready to stop fighting the storm. Snow fell thick and slow outside our South Boston apartment, the kind that muffled every sound and made the city feel softer. It was Christmas Eve, 2026. The lights along the street glowed golden through the curtain of snow, and inside our living room was warm, filled with the smell of cinnamon and pine. My father poured 2 glasses of red wine and set one in front of me. The fire cracked quietly in the small brick fireplace we'd restored ourselves last year. On the table sat the same set of mismatched dishes we'd used since I was a kid. No crystal, no silver, just ours. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes bright behind his reading glasses. "Hard to believe it's been almost 2 years, he said. I smiled. "Feels like another lifetime." He raised his glass slightly. "You've built quite a life, Clara Hayes. The city talks about that park like it's a miracle." I laughed. "It's just a park. It's peace," he said. "You built something they never had, a place where people actually feel welcome." Outside, I could hear laughter echoing from the park down the block, the one that bore our name now. Children were chasing each other through the snow, while a young couple posed under the Christmas tree I'd planted that spring. Someone had strung lights around it, and from here it looked like the tree was glowing from within. I watched them through the window for a long moment before turning back to him. "You ever think about them?" He didn't have to ask who I meant. He sipped his wine, then nodded. "Sometimes, mostly to remind myself that some people don't change until they lose everything that lets them pretend they're better." "Eleanor wrote again last month," I said quietly. "She sent a donation to the foundation." "I know," he said. "We accepted it, not because she deserves forgiveness, but because the kids do." I nodded. The Hayes Foundation had grown faster than either of us expected. My father's idea, scholarships and programs for children raised by single parents, had become one of the most praised charity initiatives in Boston. Every week brought new stories of families getting second chances, and for once, his name in the news wasn't about wealth or secrecy. It was about giving back. I traced the rim of my glass with my finger. "Do you ever regret it? The way things happened?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Do you?" I hesitated, then smiled. "No, I don't." He raised an eyebrow. "Not even a little." I shook my head. "That day, I chose you. And I chose myself. I can live with that." The firelight flickered across his face as he nodded. "Good, because I don't regret a thing either." We fell into a comfortable silence. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and endless. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring for midnight mass. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You know, I used to worry you'd inherit my stubbornness," he said. "I did," I said with a grin. "It just looks better on me." He laughed, a sound so full of warmth it almost hurt. We toasted again quietly, this time no words needed. Through the window, I watched the family in the park finish their photos. The father lifted his little girl onto his shoulders. She was laughing, waving her mittens in the air. They looked like something out of a storybook, ordinary, beautiful, and real. I turned back to my father. "Respect shouldn't be a privilege," I said softly. "It should be the bare minimum." He smiled. "That's the kind of lesson you don't learn from books, Clara. You live it." The clock chimed midnight. Snow drifted past the window, catching the reflection of our Christmas lights. The world outside looked brand new, blank, and full of possibility. I thought about everything we'd survived. The humiliation, the silence, the noise of a world that had watched us like entertainment. Justice hadn't come with applause. It had come here in this quiet kitchen, in the laughter outside, in the life we rebuilt with our own hands. We sat there a while longer listening to the wind. Eventually I got up and opened the window just enough to let in a breath of cold air. The smell of snow and pine filled the room. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Not because the world finally understood what was right, but because I did. And maybe that was enough. If you've ever been judged for where you come from, if you've ever had to fight for your worth in a room that tried to make you small, tell your story. Someone out there needs to hear it tonight. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.